The Vampyre by John William Polidori was inspired by The Burial, a Fragment by Lord Byron, to whom Polidori was a close friend. It is considered to be one of the primary inspirations for Stoker's Dracula. As with The Burial, a young man, Aubry, goes travelling with an older and enigmatic aristocrat, Lord Ruthven. But then this story takes a far darker turn, bringing horror and pain to the young traveller. In part 1, Aubry starts his travels with Lord Ruthven, but then begins to suspect Lord Ruthven's character as they travel, causing him to decide to go his own separate way. If you want to hear more, please click like, subscribing and clicking the bell, then all will let you know when a new episode releases. Let us know what you liked and what you want to see more of in the comments. You can even join us on Patreon. Dodger is back. If you spot him, post where in the comments, and the first correct one gets pinned to the top. For now though, it's time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. It happened that in the midst of the dissipations attendant upon a London winter, there appeared at the various parties of the leaders of the ton a nobleman more remarkable for his singularities than his rank. He gazed upon the mirth around him as if he could not participate therein. Apparently, the light laughter of the fair only attracted his attention, that he might by a look quell it and throw fear into those breasts where thoughtlessness reigned. Those who felt this sensation of awe could not explain whence it arose. Some attributed it to the dead grey eye which, fixing upon the object's face, did not seem to penetrate, and at one glance to pierce through to the inward workings of the heart, but fell upon the cheek with a leaden ray that weighed upon the skin it could not pass. His peculiarities caused him to be invited to every house. All wished to see him, and those who had been accustomed to violent excitement and now felt the weight of ennui were pleased at having something in their presence capable of engaging their attention. In spite of the deadly hue of his face, which never gained a warmer tint, either from the blush of modesty or from the strong emotion of passion, though its form and outline were beautiful, many of the female hunters, after notoriety, attempted to win his attentions and gain at least some marks of what they might term affection. Lady Mercer, who had been the mockery of every monster shewn in drawing rooms since her marriage, threw herself in his way and did all but put on the dress of a mountebank to attract his notice, though in vain. When she stood before him, though his eyes were apparently fixed on hers, still it seemed as if they were unperceived. Even her unappalled impudence was baffled, and she left the field. But though the common adulteress could not influence even the guidance of his eyes, it was not that the female sex was indifferent to it, yet such was the apparent caution with which he spoke to the virtuous wife and innocent daughter that few knew he ever addressed himself to females. He had, however, the reputation of a winning tongue, and whether it was that it even overcame the dread of his singular character, or that they were moved by his apparent hatred of vice, he was as often among those females who form the boast of their sex from their domestic virtues as among those who sully it by their voices. About the same time, there came to London a young gentleman of the name of Aubry. He was an orphan left with an only sister in the possession of great wealth by parents who died while he was yet in childhood. Left also to himself by guardians who thought it their duty merely to take care of his fortune, while they relinquished the more important charge of his mind to the care of mercenary subalterns. He cultivated more his imagination than his judgment. He had hence that high romantic feeling of honour and candour which daily ruins so many milliners' apprentices. He believed all to sympathise with virtue, and thought that vice was thrown in by Providence merely for the picturesque effect of the scene, as we see in romances. He thought that the misery of a cottage merely consisted in the vesting of clothes which were as warm, but which were better adapted to the painter's eye by their irregular folds and the various coloured patches. He thought, in fine, that the dreams of poets were the realities of life. He was handsome, frank, and rich. For these reasons, upon his entering into the gay circles, many mothers surrounded him, striving which should describe with least truth their lavishing or romping favourites. The daughters at the same time by their brightening countenances when he approached, and by their sparkling eyes when he opened his lips, soon led him into false notions of his talents and merit. Attached as he was to the romance of his solitary hours, he was startled at finding that except in the tallow and wax candles that flickered, not from the presence of a ghost, but from want of snuffing, there was no foundation in real life for any of that congeries or pleasing pictures and descriptions contained in those volumes from which he had formed his study. Finding, however, some compensation in his gratified vanity, he was about to relinquish his dreams when the extraordinary being we have above described crossed him in his career. He watched him, and the very impossibility of forming an idea of the character of a man entirely absorbed in himself, who gave few other signs of his observation of external objects than the tacit assent to their existence, implied by the avoidance of their contact, allowing his imagination to picture everything that flattered its propensity to extravagant ideas. He soon formed this object into the hero of a romance, and determined to observe the offspring of his fancy, rather than the person before him. He became acquainted with him, paid him attentions, and so far advanced upon his notice that his presence was always recognised. He gradually learnt that Lord Ruthven's affairs were embarrassed, and soon found from the notes of preparation in the street that he was about to travel. desirous of gaining some information respecting this singular character who, till now, had only whetted his curiosity, he hinted to his guardians that it was time for him to perform the tour, which for many generations had been thought necessary to enable the young to take some rapid steps in the career of vice towards putting themselves upon equality with the aged, and not allowing them to appear as if fallen from the skies whenever scandalous intrigues are mentioned as the subjects of pleasantry or praise according to the degree of skill shown in carrying them on. They had consented, and Aubrey, immediately mentioning his attentions to Lord Ruthven, was surprised to receive from him a proposal to join him. Flattered by such a mark of esteem from him who apparently had nothing in common with other men, he gladly accepted it, and in a few days they had passed the circling waters. Hitherto, Aubrey had had no opportunity of studying Lord Ruthven's character, and now he found that, though many more of his actions were exposed to his view, the results offered different conclusions from the apparent motives to his conduct. His companion was profuse in his liberality. The idle, the vagabond, and the beggar received from his hand more than enough to relieve their immediate wants. But Aubrey could not avoid remarking that it was not upon the virtuous, reduced to indignance by the misfortunes attendant even upon virtue, that he bestowed his alms. These were sent to the door with hardly suppressed sneers. But when the profligate came to ask something, not to relieve his wants, but to allow him to wallow in his lust, or to sink him still deeper in his iniquity, he was sent away with rich charity. This was, however, attributed to him for the greater importunity of the vicious, which generally prevails over the retiring bashfulness of the virtuous indigent. There was one circumstance about the charity of his lordship which was still more impressed upon his mind. All those upon whom it was bestowed inevitably found that there was a curse upon it, for they were either led to the scaffold or sunk into the lowest and most abject misery. At Brussels and other towns, though, which they passed, Aubrey was surprised at the apparent eagerness with which his companion sought for the centres of all fashionable vice. There he entered into all the spirit of the Pharaoh table. He betted and always gambled with success, except where there was a known sharper that was his antagonist, and then he lost even more than he gained. But it was always with the same unchanging face with which he generally watched the society around. It was not, however, so when he encountered the rash youthful novice or the luckless father of a numerous family. Then his very wish seemed fortune's law. This apparent abstractedness of mind was laid aside, and his eyes sparkled with more fire than that of the cat while dallying with the half-dead mouse. In every town he left the formerly affluent youth, torn from the circle he adorned, cursing in the solitude of a dungeon the fate that had drawn him within the reach of this fiend, whilst many a father sat frantic amidst the speaking looks of mute, hungry children, without a single farthing of his late immense wealth, wherewith to buy even sufficient to satisfy their present craving. Yet he took no money from the gambling table, but immediately lost to the ruiner of many the last guilder he had just snatched from the convulsive grasp of the innocent. This might but be the result of a certain degree of knowledge, which was not, however, capable of combating the cunning of the most experienced. Aubrey often wished to represent this to his friend and beg him to resign that charity and pleasure which proved the ruin of all and did not tend to his own profit. But he delayed it, for each day he hoped his friend would give him some opportunity of speaking frankly and open to him. However, this never occurred. Lord Ruthven, in his carriage and amidst the various wild and rich scenes of nature, was always the same. His eye spoke less than his lip, and though Aubrey was near the object of his curiosity, he attained no greater gratification from it than the constant excitement of vainly wishing to break that mystery which, to his exalted imagination, began to assume the appearance of something supernatural. They soon arrived at Rome, and Aubrey, for a time, lost sight of his companion. He left him in daily attendance upon the mourning circle of an Italian countess, whilst he went in search of the memorials of another almost deserted city. Whilst he was thus engaged, letters arrived from England, which he opened with an eager impatience. The first was from his sister, breathing nothing but affection. The others were from his guardians. The latter astonished him. If it had before entered into his imagination that there was an evil power resident in his companion, these seemed to give him almost sufficient reason for the belief. His guardians insisted upon his immediately leaving his friend and urged that his character was dreadfully vicious, for that the possession of irreversible powers of seduction rendered his licentious habits more dangerous to society. It had been discovered that his contempt for the adulteress had not originated in hatred of her character, but that he had required to enhance his gratification that his victim, the partner of his guilt, should be hurled from the pinnacle of unsullied virtue down to the lowest abyss of infamy and degradation. In fine, that all those females whom he had sought, apparently on account of their virtue, had since his departure thrown even the mask aside and had not scrupled to expose the whole deformity of their vices to public gaze. Audrey determined upon leaving one whose character had not yet shown a single bright point on which to rest his eye. He resolved to invent some plausible pretext for abandoning him altogether, proposing in the meanwhile to watch him more closely and let no slight circumstances pass by unnoticed. He entered into the same circle and soon perceived that his lordship was endeavouring to work upon the inexperience of the daughter of the lady whose house he chiefly frequented. In Italy, it is seldom that an unmarried female is met with in society. He was therefore obliged to carry on his plans in secret. But Aubry's eyes followed him in all his windings, and soon discovered that an assignation had been appointed, which would most likely end in the ruin of an innocent, though thoughtless girl. Losing no time, he entered the apartment of Lord Ruthven and abruptly asked him his intentions with respect to the lady, informing him at the same time that he was aware of his being about to meet her that very night. Lord Ruthven answered that his intentions were such as he supposed all would have upon such an occasion, and upon being pressed whether he intended to marry her, merely laughed. Aubry retired, and immediately writing a note to say that from that moment he must decline accompanying his lordship in the remainder of their promised tour. He ordered his servant to seek other apartments, and calling upon the mother of the lady, informed her of all he knew, not only with regard to her daughter, but also concerning the character of his lordship. The assignation was prevented. Lord Ruthven next day merely sent his servant to notify his complete assent to a separation, but did not hint any suspicion of his plans having been foiled by Aubry's interposition. Having left Rome, Aubry directed his steps towards Greece, and crossing the peninsula, soon found himself at Athens. He then fixed his residence in the house of a Greek, and soon occupied himself in tracing the faded records of ancient glory upon monuments that apparently, ashamed of chronicling the deeds of freemen only before slaves, had hidden themselves beneath the sheltering soil or many-coloured lichen. Under the same roof as himself existed a being so beautiful and delicate that she might have formed the model for a painter, wishing to portray on canvas the promised hope of the faithful in Muhammad's paradise, save that her eyes spoke too much mind for anyone to think she could belong to those who had no souls. As she danced upon the plain or tripped along the mountainside, one would have thought the gazelle a poor type of her beauties, for who would have exchanged her eye, apparently the eye of animated nature, for that sleepy, luxurious look of the animal suited but to the taste of an epicure? The light step of Lanthe often accompanied Aubry in his search after antiquities, and often would the unconscious girl engage in the pursuit of a cashmere butterfly, shown the whole beauty of her form, floating as if it were upon the wind to the eager gaze of him who forgot the letters he had just deciphered upon the almost effaced tablet in the contemplation of her self-like figure. Often would her tresses falling as she flitted around exhibit in the sun's ray such delicately brilliant and swiftly fading hues as might well excuse the forgetfulness of the antiquary, who let escape from his mind the very object he had before thought of vital importance to the proper interpretation of a passage from Parnassus. But why attempt to describe the charms which all feel but none can appreciate? It was innocence, youth and beauty, unaffected by crowded drawing rooms and stifling balls. Whilst he drew those remains of which he wished to preserve a memorial for his future hours, she would stand by and watch the magic effects of his pencil in tracing the scenes of her native place. She would then describe to him the circling dance upon the open plain, would paint to him all the glowing colours of youthful memory, the marriage pomp she remembered viewing in her infancy, and then, turning to subjects that had evidently made a greater impression upon her mind, would tell him all the supernatural tales of her nurse. Her earnestness and apparent belief of what she narrated excited the interest even of Aubry, and often as she told him the tale of the living vampire who would pass years amidst his friends and dearest ties, forced every year by feeding upon the life of a lovely female to prolong his existence for the ensuing months, his blood would run cold whilst he attempted to laugh her out of such idle and horrible fantasies. But Lanthe cited to him the names of old men who had at last detected one living amongst themselves after several of their near relatives and children had been found marked with the stamp of the fiend's appetite. And when she found him so incredulous, she begged him to believe her, for it had been remarked that those who had dared question their existence always had some proof given which obliged them, with grief and heartbreaking, to confess it was true. She detailed to him the traditional appearance of these monsters, and his horror was increased by hearing a pretty accurate description of Lord Ruthven. He, however, still persisted in persuading her that there could be no truth in her fears, though at the same time he wondered at the many coincidences which had all tended to excite the belief in the supernatural power of Lord Ruthven. So ends part 1 of The Vampire. Can you see the links with both the work by Byron and the later works by Stoker, and perhaps the whole of the vampire genre? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed the tale, it helps us if you let others know, so please click the like button and share with others that may be interested. Subscribing will let you travel with us on further adventures of the dark and terrible, with the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our Eldritch Order on Discord, come visit us on Patreon. Then you can join in the discussions and even help guide the choice of stories. If you spotted Dodger, don't forget to post in the comments. See the description for details of the Patreon and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about modern board games where you can create your own dark and terrible stories. Until next time, farewell, but be wary your choice in companions, as things are not always as they seem.